Hello, I'm Sam Blaxland, author of The Conservative Party in Wales, 1945 to 1997. We recorded this podcast when the general election campaign was in full swing, and as you'll hear, we discuss some of the challenges facing the Conservative Party this year. Now that the election is behind us and the Conservatives have had such a terrible result in Wales, my reflections are that on top of the historical reasons for their low support in Wales as opposed to England, there is obviously a sense that many of the past 14 years have been wasted. And that's both from a left-wing and a conservative perspective. The role of reform in the campaign also had a huge impact on the results. It does look like enough conservative voters abandoned the Tories and voted for reform in enough numbers to deny people like Stephen Crabb or David T.C. Davis a chance of clinging on in their seats. Now, as the party seeks to rebuild in Wales, the kind of discussions it will be having will likely include how to tackle this threat from reform, and whether to stress a more robust brand of conservatism, or whether to tack to the so-called centre, as they have in the past, which appeared to work well for them under the leadership of Nick Bourne. As you'll hear me discuss, my belief is that there's an upper ceiling for the Conservatives in Wales. We see this from the figures and the data. And it may take another party at the right with less of the baggage that the Tories are lumbered with to smash through that ceiling. But of course, neither the Tories or Reform would benefit from a splitting of the right-wing vote. With Reform having had such a good night in Wales, coming second across the country and nearly winning internationally, they have the potential to be a significant force in the future. Now, thinking about that, my book ends in 1997, which is the beginning of the devolution age, but there is an epilogue in it where I discuss the devolution period too. It's been argued that the Senedd election in 1999 opened up a pathway for the Conservative Party to rebuild by electing some members to Cardiff Bay. And we're likely to see the same in 2026, especially because of our voting system. But the dynamic with Reform will be the one thing to really watch. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and you can find out more about my book by using the link in the show notes.
Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
The Conservative Party in Wales consistently polls at about a third of the electorate, and yet it has never managed to win a majority across the country in the modern age. For a party with such widespread territorial and popular support, what is it that has prevented it from repeating in Wales what it has managed to do in England, and, to use the famous cliché, to become the natural party of government here? To discuss past, present, and perhaps even the future of the Conservative Party in Wales, we're joined by friend of the pod, historian Dr. Sam Blaxland, author of the recently published history, The Conservative Party in Wales, 1945 to 1997. Welcome, Sam. It's very nice to see you again.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
When we started talking about this podcast many years ago, I think it may even have been during the pandemic period over what was then Twitter, who would have thought that we would be recording it in the middle of a UK general election when the Conservative and Unionist party is trying to redefine itself once more and try to hold on to at least one seat in Wales over the next few weeks. This must be sort of familiar context for you, because you describe in the preface to your book that you grew up in the 1990s when the electoral conditions for the Conservative Party were largely similar in Wales to those that they're facing today. Do you see any parallels with the current period and that period in the 1990s?
Yes, in short. I think the default for some people sometimes is to reach into our recent history and recent past and try desperately to draw parallels. And for a while I've been saying, but before some of the more recent dire polls for the Conservative Party, what happens in the next general election doesn't have to be 1992 or 1997. It doesn't have to be what looks like victories of snatched from the jaws of defeat like John Major seemed to manage to do in 1992. And neither does it have to be this wipeout, certainly in places like Wales, this landslide victory for Labour like it was in 1997. As time's gone on, however, it does look more and more like it's going to be closer to a 1997. But I'm still not convinced that it's going to be as big a landslide as that. I just think that Labour across the board are not as popular, competent, or at least giving off the air of being a governing party in waiting like they were in the late 1990s. And there's so many more factors at play here, dynamics at play, things like turnout, things like what happens in certain constituencies where there are alternatives to Labour, be that Reform on one side or even sort of George Galloway's outfit on the other. So parallels, yes, but not completely. I would just say about the book as well is that I actually gave the manuscript in years ago, and the preface talks about the 2019 general election. It was my great fear that the book wouldn't be published until there had been another general election that basically delegitimized all the stuff I say. But there's been this tiny window between the publication of the book with its epilogue on the 2019 general election and the next general election, where all of that will become less relevant.
I can only imagine the look on your face when Rishi Sunak stepped out of that door in the rain not so long ago to call the general election, and you were just like, oh, if only you'd done this a few months earlier and or later.
I booked a flight to Australia the day before the general election, so I was a little bit peeved about that because I wouldn't have mind staying around to watch what happens. Never mind.
Well, it'll certainly be very, very interesting, one way or the other, and our listenership of the Hiraeth pod is very well informed, but there are always new listeners that come to the pod and people who perhaps haven't had the benefit of, as you know, a master's in Welsh politics or a history of Welsh politics. So I always feel like I should start pods like this with a little bit of the basics, so to speak. So if I were to ask you how you would characterise the Conservative, and I use the full name, Conservative and Unionist Party in Wales, sort of both from a popular point of view, from a support point of view, and also from a territorial point of view, how would you describe it to somebody, who didn't really have any kind of prior knowledge?
Yeah, and one of the things I find quite useful to do sometimes is imagine I'm describing this to an American audience or an Australian audience or something like that who will understand the broad context, but then you kind of think, yeah, there are certain things that do understandably need explaining. And another thing that's worth saying is that in the period that I'm interested in, which is, well, it's the 20th century, but the things I write about tend to be from 1945 until now. It depends what kind of Conservative Party you're talking about, because it does change quite dramatically during that time. I say in the book, the conservatisms of Winston Churchill, Harold Macmillan, Margaret Thatcher, David Cameron are all very distinct and different from one another. But what binds it? What are the threads? And I suppose one of them is that broadly in the UK context, the Conservative Party has always been about seeking and winning office, and often winning office for people who feel like they are born to rule and born to be in office. It does tend to be the party of, if not the upper classes, then certainly kind of the middle and upper middle classes. And that's a kind of that's a continuity. But on the whole, it is certainly a unionist outfit. It believes in the integrity of the United Kingdom, although it also, when it's doing well, I think, does recognise and understand that the different parts of the UK are different. That Scottish, Welsh identities are the change. But yeah, I mean, in Wales, as in the UK, what your core Tory supporter, I guess, is, you can be working class, and you certainly, there are plenty of working class Tories around, but broadly it's the people who are more middle class, often rooted in suburban areas. They might be small business owners. In Wales, they're certainly quite anglicised. Normally, they can still be very Welsh born and bred, but they're often not Welsh speaking. And if we look at the Welsh context, you find the most Tories in the big border constituencies of Wales that kind of are next to England. So your Brecon and Radnors, your Montgomeryshires, or Monmouth. You find them on the North Wales coast as well, which typically traditionally has a lot of retirees living there, or English incomers. So there's that element of your typical Tory voter is often older as well. And in terms of policy, and this is what I find very interesting, the Conservative Party has changed from being a sort of broadly small c conservative on social and cultural matters to dropping a lot of that over time. The contemporary Conservative Party isn't particularly socially and culturally conservative, I don't think. And the form of economic policy that they follow, you could argue, isn't especially conservative either in the current context, because from the Thatcher period certainly onwards, Tory parties broadly been quite free marketeer, as supposedly been quite low tax orientated, although that's not the case now especially. But they in some ways look like what you would expect 19th century liberals, kind of Gladstonian liberals, to look like. So it's like pinning jelly to a wall. I mean, political scientists can do it and do it, but saying exactly what the Conservative Party is and what it's for is not easy. And some people say that's its great strength, that it can shapeshift to appeal to the electorate. Other people on the other side, even including some conservatives, would say that it is morally and politically a bit too flexible and unprincipled. So take your pick.
Certainly that adaptability is something that you know, has been proven over the years to be, as you quite rightly say, electorally advantageous for it. I suppose, as a Welsh podcast, I think we would be remiss of us not to ask the question, what, if any, does the party have a special relationship? Oh wow! I've just invoked the special relationship phrase with Wales, because Wales is sort of has in terms of UK politics both existed and not existed as a discrete entity for a long time, and certainly in the period that you're talking about. So we're looking at the pre-97 devolution period. Oh, I'm sorry, my dog has just decided to start lapping some water. That isn't me, dear listener. What, if any, relationship has the party formally had with Wales and the idea of Welsh nationhood, if we can even call it that? Can you paint us a picture about what, if anything, exists in that front?
Well, it's interesting that you accidentally invoked the special relationship there, because one could say that just as the special relationship with the US doesn't really exist, and that's a bit of a myth. Perhaps the relationship between the Tory party and Wales is a bit of a myth too. But I think there is something there, and the book that I've written does concentrate on this theme quite a lot. I say it's not the most important element of the party's history in Wales, because it's doing a lot of other things that are important and interesting that don't involve Welsh nationhood or aren't about identity or devolution or anything like that. But I still think there's something there. And if you look historically, the Conservatives used to be, say in the 1950s, for example, quite effective at articulating a certain Scottish identity and image. When they were the Unionist party, and they represented a very kind of core part of the Scottish electorate then. The Welsh story, I think, is significant because from the very early 1950s, it is the Conservative Party that introduces the first Minister for Welsh Affairs. In fact, I think it's such an important moment. The said person, David Maxwell Fyfe, is actually on the front cover of my book. And the reason that the Tories do this is part of a wider discussion, a wider conversation about administrative devolution, about this trickling down of power from what they say from Whitehall to Town Hall. This idea that over centralising power in say Westminster is actually quite a socialist thing to do, and it's what they're claiming the Attlee government did after the war, and to some extent that is true. So the story of their engagement with Welsh nationhood does kind of stem from that, but I think it's also a reaction or an attempt to address what they rightly see as their image problem in Wales. So well into the 20th century, but it's kind of a 19th century hangover. The Tory party has this kind of anglicised, landed elite image in a way that is very un-Welsh, because it's a kind of almost a sort of oppressive Anglican landlord thing going on, and that's obviously gone by much of the 20th century, but the image still remains. And the party, I think, do a lot of things to try and say, look, we are compatible with elements of the nation to an extent, even though most of their personnel, their MPs, their grassroots don't speak Welsh, for example, sometimes don't look or feel very culturally Welsh. After they introduced the Minister for Welsh Affairs, it is the Tory party that, for the majority of the rest of that period, partly because they are in office for the majority of that period, but it is the party that do, I would say, meaningful things to buttress the idea of the Welsh nation and of Welsh nationhood. So under Peter Thomas, the Secretary of State in the early 1970s, you get a bigger drive for bilingualism. And then really interestingly, in the 1980s, under the Thatcher government, something you might not expect, you get a real genuine attempt to reinforce the status and the importance of not just the language, but of kind of Welsh broadcasting, specific Welsh quangos. You get what I say is the beginning of, it's not just my thoughts, I've kind of borrowed this from other people, but beginnings of what looks like a Welsh state. And I think the indirect impact of that is that the Tories are responsible for creating a more distinct Welsh nation. And I say this all the time about me, that I'm quite a good example in some ways, that I, as you can tell, born and bred in very anglicised Pembrokeshire, and yet the first generation who for whom it was compulsory to learn Welsh. And my peers almost certainly have a stronger sense of being Welsh because incidental Welsh was used all the time. Very few of us speak it fluently, but we know enough to recognise that we are distinct and different from England. And I think that has, in a very subtle but meaningful way, reinforced and buttressed that sense of identity, but also supporting the language, giving lots of money to it, has reversed a sense of decline in terms of numbers of speakers and people who have access to Welsh language documents, etc. So I think in that sense, the party's relationship with the nation and elements of Welsh nationhood are much more interesting and detailed than we might think. But that still goes hand in hand with the fact that they've never really shook off this image as the kind of English party, if you like. That's how a lot of people see them. And there's a huge irony in that, which I do try and go into in the book quite a lot, which is that they are, to some extent, the creators of the modern nation, but in that process, they kind of othered themselves as the English lot, which is, it sort of seems a little bit unfair, but in other ways is justified.
Yes, certainly. As somebody who grew up on the no man's land between Cardiff and the South Wales valleys myself, the Conservatives, that label of the English party in Wales certainly was something that, in the village that I grew up in, was something that was felt and kind of was not only a political choice, but it was also within the village. There were very much social circles in which certain people would act, and that kind of projected that into like day-to-day life, so what shops you visit, what places you go out for socializing, and the church was a big thing. You could Absolutely. Pretty much, what is the phrase, Sam? Is it the Conservative Party at prayer? Is that the description of
the church is
Church of England,
established Church of England. But it's very interesting. You've opened an interesting can of worms there, Richard. But I spoke to a lot of people for this book, for this project, informally, but also formally as part of a big oral history project. And it's very hard to pin down again, but there is a certain kind of person who is a Welsh Tory or a Conservative in Wales. It's a certain kind of more, I guess it often is a more well-spoken, perhaps more supposedly respectable, although you get a lot of very respectable elements to kind of left-wing politics in Wales too. But it is often quite anglicised, even a little bit tweedy sometimes, very, very, very respectable and polite and all this kind of stuff. But there is something about it, and I think it solidifies for me this idea that politics is often an expression of a wider identity, as well as a belief system.
And on that question, just before we start thinking about the book itself and kind of delving perhaps a little bit deeper in some of these questions, again, I was sort of taken by your in your preface, was very interesting to read. You described the book came out of your initial study of 70s and 80s Pembrokeshire politics when you were a master's student at Cardiff University. And Pembrokeshire has a very distinct identity in Wales, and one that has in many ways sort of favoured the Conservatives, as you've alluded to a little bit already. And how much would you say in terms of that area has kind of informed your own kind of launch pad for study in this area? Because there aren't many places in Wales, as you mentioned, where that would be a natural line of study, because the party and the party's presence is perhaps neither hugely felt or hugely popular in large parts of Wales.
I'm so glad that you brought that preface up, because I wrote that a very long time ago and I was desperate to keep it in. I'm a very easygoing chap, and I tend to do what I'm told. But if they told me to get rid of that, I would have really dug my heels in, because I think it's so important to say at the beginning of a book like this, especially if you're writing on the Conservatives in Wales and you look and sound like me. It's really worth saying, look, here are my motives for doing this. This is why I've written it. And the answer is that it's not a party interest per se. I'm not a Conservative member, activist, but it was the fact that I grew up in a part of this nation that geographically is about as far away from England as you can get, and yet it didn't feel or have the kind of history that felt like what I had been reading and studying when I was doing Welsh history, or as part of my degree when I was an undergraduate and then a master's student in Cardiff. And it's interesting because I actually think Pembrokeshire is almost a microcosm of Wales in itself. It's got a sort of Welsh-speaking northern bit, a more anglicised southern bit. It's got some industry. It's got it's got rural farming areas. It does kind of, it's quite poor. It does encapsulate a lot of the wonderful. It's very pretty as well, absolutely stunning, and it captures kind of all the great opportunities, but also some of the sadder elements of Welsh life. And yet it is different, because the bit that I'm from is anglicised, I don't think feel especially culturally Welsh, and it isn't particularly tied to things like heavy industry. So, we did have, I actually come from a coal mining village, as it happens. That coal mining finished in about 1947, but still, it's got that element of industrial heritage, but it's not the South Wales valleys, and it's not kind of Welsh-speaking Northwest Wales. And I thought it's the kind of thing we're not hearing and reading about very much in the wider historiography. And I wanted the book to be, yes, about the Conservative Party, but also about the places in which it's grounded. And I thought that was important too.
Yes, absolutely. And you managed to get all that without describing Pembrokeshire as Little England beyond Wales, which is what I'm sure that my Hiraeth co-host Kerry would have said almost straight away.
It's not quite. I mean, firstly, no one down there says that, so that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't.
Quite right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the book then. Obviously, for anyone who's listening and is interested in this subject, first thing we should say is buy it.
Oh yes, please.
There will be a link in the show notes. And also, we were just talking before we started recording, you did an event at the Pierhead recently with the Wales Governance Centre, which we'll link to the video of that event as well, for people who want to go into more depth than we can cover in this podcast. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of epochs or the eras of the party, which is what you do. You talk, essentially, the book begins in 1945 and ends in 1997, which, as you said, is the sort of 20th century, really, as we would characterize it. And the 1997 point is important, and we'll finish with that. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about each of those kind of eras that you divide it into, and why you identified those specific eras as being the kind of pillars upon which you would then write the book.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you. I think the way I've divided it up is quite a conventional way of dividing up the post-war period, but it also does map onto the different ways in which the Tories approach Wales and interact there. So the first chapter, which is long, it's actually the longest, covers the shortest time period, but it's 1945 to 1951, which is partly a source-based driven thing because there's so much material for that period, but that covers the Tories' response to their kind of shock at the time defeat in 45, how they try and address that and change their image, but also all this stuff I was mentioning a moment ago about their reorientation towards this idea of Welsh nationhood, and saying that recognising Welsh distinctiveness is actually quite a conservative thing to do, because a lot of Welsh identity is rooted and grounded in community and in the past and all that kind of stuff. So that's the first bit, but it also concentrates a lot on how the Conservatives deploy this anti-Labour message about the dangers of socialism. And I go into how people are receptive to that in some parts, but obviously in a country that has just, or in a nation that has just voted in with huge majorities, lots and lots of Labour MPs, that message doesn't always land very well. The next chapter is then 50. I'm doing this without looking, so I'm just hoping I'm right. But the next chapter is 51 to 64, which covers a long period of Conservative government, but also a period of kind of growing affluence. And it's me saying that in some ways, the messaging from the Conservative Party in that period, which is that they are the party of the aspirational people, that they are the party of kind of the lower middle classes, does chime in Wales with a certain group of the core supporters. And I begin that chapter with Michael Heseltine saying that he is in some ways indicative of all of those themes, kind of from money, but also self-made, well-spoken, all that kind of stuff. So there's lots in there about, again, the reorientation to Wales, but also how the party do present themselves as the party of supposed affluence. The next chapter is 64 to 79. So 75. It covers most 75, of course, because that is important, because when Thatcher comes in 75, there's a new moment. But the theme in that chapter is something I didn't expect to write about, but it came out of the sources so much that I had to, which is that this is a period that is characterized by modernity. It's the kind of the white heat of the technological revolution, although Harold Wilson didn't, that speech is slightly misunderstood. But nonetheless, it is a period of modernization and kind of modernity to some extent, although also of economic crises. one of the core arguments I make there is that what the Tory party do, I think driven by the rise of Plaid Cymru, but also as a result of kind of liberal pavement politics, is that despite this growing kind of sense of globalization or people being able to travel more, their focus becomes more and more on the local and on constituency specific concerns. And I think it is in this period that we see them becoming more professional in that sense and working out that, look, we do need people who are from certain communities to be representing those communities and trying to stand for Parliament for them, for example, rather than just always drafting in these outsiders, which is something that the Tories have always had a bad record on, sending home counties solicitors to fight a Valleys seat just for experience. And then the final chapter, which I suspect is often the one of most interest to people because it's such an interesting mixed story, is 75 to 97. So it starts with the arrival of Thatcher to the Conservative Party leadership, but just as important for our purposes, it's the arrival of some very key Welsh MPs to the Welsh Office brief, particularly Nicholas Edwards and Wyn Roberts, who really do, as I said a moment ago, do more than any previous administration to interact with or engage with this idea of Welsh nationhood. So that's all in there. But there's also the stuff that is kind of the on the other hand stuff, which is the winding down of industry, the cementing of the negative reactions or negative attitudes to the Conservative Party in places that never really used to like them anyway. But that chapter goes into, 1983 is a very good election for the party, even though its vote share isn't the highest it ever got. It did win 14 seats. And it's just asking, why were some of those seats, why were 3 of the 4 Cardiff seats in the 80s Conservative? That's really interesting in a period where urban areas are drifting away from the Conservative Party. Why does Cardiff West go Tory? Why is Newport West Tory? Why is Bridgend Tory in those seats, in that election? Why does what's by this point called Ynys Môn, Anglesey, go Conservative? There's a lot of, if you unpick, I hate that phrase, but you do start to dissect that story. There is something there about the non-unionised working classes being receptive to conservatism, to Wales just being politically a much more varied story than Labour country. So it sort of goes into all of that. And then just very briefly, running through the whole book, there's a section in each chapter which looks at ordinary, but grassroots activists, people who joined the party and worked for the party. And there's some really interesting characters in there, some interesting names that reflect intriguingly on the nature of kind of grassroots conservatism in Wales. And I ask what they did for the party, which is often quite a lot in terms of fundraising and knocking on doors, but also what they reflect about broader society in your Monmouthshires, your Cardiffs, your Pembrokeshires, your North Wales coasts. Again, something I don't think we hear very, very much about.
The book is very, very interesting, and I as I said earlier, anyone who has an interest in this area, and in fact anyone who wants to try and understand modern Wales, I think would do doing really well to read the book. As you sort of teased a little bit there, I'm actually going to focus a little bit on that 4th section, because I think there's a lot of stuff in that era, the era of Thatcherism, beyond the deindustrialization, that I think is really quite important for us to understand where we are in Wales today. But just in terms of that kind of arc of the first 3 sections, I just wanted to kind of throw an idea at you about how much the Conservative Party was working in response to other events that were taking place at the time, and what that kind of tells us about that journey that the Conservative Party was on after the Second World War. Because you mentioned that the First Minister for Wales was Conservative, and of course that stands that the battle to create that role was not a Conservative battle necessarily in the Labour Party at the time, and for a long time afterwards there was an awful lot of resistance to creating a ministerial position, even a cabinet level role for someone to represent the interests of Wales. But also, as you quite rightly mentioned, there was also a sort of, particularly in the 1960s period, there was a whole kind of emergence of the idea of political Wales. Obviously, Plaid Cymru won its first seat, and not too far away from Pembrokeshire, and that was actually a transformational period for Wales. So in some ways, the party, in order to try and find political space in order to keep on winning, it was trying to move into these gaps where the other forces were not blocking out areas or kind of changing the political dynamics. So slightly waffly question here, but
No,
in
it's
terms
good.
of the way the party responded to those challenges, are there any kind of key elements there or kind of key themes that you would draw out over those decades between the Second World War and Thatcherism or Margaret Thatcher leading?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because something that is in the book is that I don't think the Tories have a huge amount of agency in Wales in this sense. They are often responding to other things, and often responding quite well, but they're not driving the agenda all the time. And also, all political parties work in very wide contexts, and the post-war period is a period of complete ending and winding down of empire, for example. I do think it is a period which is really one of quite serious decline, and it's about managed decline as well. And parts of that period kind of patch up that story of decline, but really it's not certainly a successful period in terms of the broad arc and sweep of British history. But for the specifics here, the First Minister for Welsh Affairs isn't introduced in a vacuum. For example, there were big conversations happening during the war, saying that Wales doesn't have the representation it deserves, and you've got these pressure groups. The Parliament for Wales campaign being just one example. You have got some people within Labour making quite strong noises wanting it. So it is partly a response to that, and this idea of we should just plant our flag on this issue to be clear on what we think. And absolutely, the stuff in the 1960s and this response to more local concerns is a direct response to Plaid Cymru, because I think what people forget now in the contemporary context is that there were elements of Plaid, certainly in those earlier days, that were much more conservative. And the Tory research team, and I found a lot of this information in the archives, the Tory research team were really quite worried about the threat from Plaid Cymru. And they used to conduct surveys in seats that they thought would become Tory Plaid marginals to work out what mattered to Plaid voters the most. And often they found the answers they were looking for, which is that they wanted the old ways to be kept. They wanted the language to be supported. They believed in being kind of rooted in your local area. And a good example of that is the Denbigh constituency, which had for a very long time an MP called Geraint Morgan, who I'm quite interested in, who really resisted swings away to Plaid and the Liberals, because I think he was in some ways a soft end nationalist, and he kind of stole their thunder in those areas and was quite popular for it. Even during really challenging elections like 1966, he resists a swing away from the Conservatives in that seat. So yes, a lot of what the Tories do and how they respond to things are definitely pressures from essentially other political parties who are better at making the weather. And I do try and bring that out a lot in the book, as well as saying that this is. I do try and give the Tories credit for some of the stuff they do well, and we do obviously naturally focus on the places in which they're more successful. But there are big chunks of the book that say, look, they're absolutely appalling and terrible in certain parts of Wales, and this is how they're terrible, and this is the result of that is that they perform so badly there.
I remember a little while ago reading a little bit about Geraint Morgan, and I think for people who see the contemporary Conservative Party would do well to look at his biography and the things that he was, the way he presented himself, because it really does subvert what one might think of as a conservative MP, and certainly in the current age.
Although he would never survive that, because I don't think he asked a question in the House of Commons for about 8 years. He was one of these people who kept being a solicitor and prioritised doing his what even a barrister, I can't quite remember, but he was often in court even during really key votes in that Parliament in the late 1970s where they needed every vote they could get. He was one of the hardest ones to bring in to vote. So in that sense, he would never make it as Tory MP, but he was a good local constituency man. And I wrote an article on him for, it's up there on my shelf, but it's for the transactions of the Denbighshire Historical Society, I think, and his daughter got in touch to say, you've nailed it. Essentially, you've got him right that he was a complicated man, not a particularly good MP in some ways, but also very good in others. So I was pleased that I managed to tease that out.
Yeah, really fascinating. I feel a little bit like I'm chasing the clock. I have so many questions that I want to ask you, but one of the things that I want to sort of focus in on in the Thatcher era, because rapid deindustrialization, in inverted commas, the reform of the UK under Thatcher, privatisation, etc., that whole agenda is quite well litigated. And I'm not sure whether I'm doing a disservice really, but by skimming over this, because there's so much to dig into here. But there are two questions that I really want to kind of focus in on in this era. One is the end of the 1970s and the first national devolution referendum in Wales, 1979. What was the Conservative position on devolution to Wales, creation of a Welsh Assembly at that period? I think we probably all know the answer to this, but what is the nuance around that? What are we missing, Sam?
I mean, the arguments were not dissimilar to the 1997 arguments, which is that it was a costly, unnecessary extra layer of government, which does need to be read in the context of what we were talking about a moment ago, which is that they did not believe in power trickling down. I just don't think that at the time, they thought that doing so in a unit that would become a national parliament and would therefore, as they predicted at the time, be dominated by socialists, as they said at the time, would work in either in Wales's favour, but certainly not in the party's favour. And of course, because the conditions were not right in 79 for people to feel like they'd voted for it, it did give the Tories some very big confidence boost. And even their opponents said, look, they judged the mood music on this one at this time correctly, and that they have managed to say that that this isn't the right thing at this moment, and it, like I say, gave them a confidence boost. So there are nuances around it, but also it is pretty straightforward. But then it's also similar sorts of things to what Labour people like Neil Kinnock were saying at the time. So it wasn't just the Tories being able to almost sing with one voice, not universally, because there were Tories who liked the idea of a National Assembly, but seeming to be singing from the same hymn sheet and then getting results that they'd argued for was obviously quite a good look at the time.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. And we'll touch on that again before we finish that question about relation to devolution or home rule or whatever in the Welsh context. But the other aspect of the Conservative era in Wales that I think I just would like to draw out a little bit of your thoughts on is not the deindustrialisation stuff, but it's something that friend of the pod, Dr. Dan Evans, has written about quite extensively in his recent book, The Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie. In terms of the way that the Thatcher era changed Wales, there was, I think it's fair to say, a huge appetite for the rise of the self-made man with a, what pejoratively in some contexts could be called white van man, but basically a man who runs his own business, perhaps a tradesman. And that was linked to other policies, famously right to buy is one of the policies that really defined that era. And I would just kind of like to tease out from your experience, certainly and more on that oral history perhaps side of things, but whether you feel that played a considerable role in Wales sort of changing the underlying strata for the political parties in Wales or not?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Where do you begin? I mean, the characterization of Thatcherism and the critique that has often come from it, I think, is a valid one, which is that it did emphasize a certain kind of individualism. And I think Margaret Thatcher is absolutely extraordinary person and politician. I mean, to rise to the top of the Conservative Party as a woman in the mid-70s is extraordinary. And she was so clever and with a courage of conviction that you have to, in my view, admire her. But the more I've read and the more that I've researched and the older I get, the more I think that what happened in her period was not good, and it did solve some problems, but actually created new ones. And I really dislike this idea that things being basically done by balance sheets and working the cost of things, but the value of, but not really thinking about the value of other things is a problem. And I think the reason that it appealed to some people in Wales but didn't appeal to a lot of people is because there is that kind of communitarian spirit in large parts of Wales that simply Thatcherism just didn't necessarily chime with. But on the other hand, yes, loads of people took up the right to buy opportunities. It was per head, there were more council houses sold in Wales than in England in the 1980s. You do get a sense, I think, of that idea of, well, look, the country is declining, we need a different approach. And one of my favourite bits of facts of this period is that more people vote Conservative in Wales in 1987 than in 1983, and the miners' strike has played out in between that period. Lots of council houses obviously been sold, and even though they lose seats, you actually do have more people in certain areas voting Tory, because they obviously approve of all of these kinds of things. So it basically drives a wedge between two different kinds of Welsh society, I think. And yes, this does come out in the oral history stuff. People say that they were kind of swept away by it and taken and swept away by the opportunities it posed. But one of the things I find so interesting is that more and more people in hindsight do what I've done, which is to come to the realization that a lot of it was built on foundations of sound, and that whilst it seemed like the right thing to do at the time, and Thatcher was very courageous in politically, it had negative consequences that the people at the time didn't intend and didn't see coming, but have unleashed some not very nice kind of societal forces. And I didn't interview him, but you see Norman Tebbit, for example, one of the last surviving cabinet ministers of that era, saying this, that he said we didn't know the forces that we were unleashing, the fact that deregulation might lead to greed and all this kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't play out in that way necessarily in the Welsh context, but I think it does weaken some of the bonds of things that hold civil society and communities together. And I think that just isn't a good thing. And I do think that the critiques of Thatcherism are valid sometimes.
And I have to apologise in that we're going to scoot along to a conclusion here, and we're going to cover some of the most interesting periods of recent history. I'm not going to do them full service now, but I have to obviously draw attention to the fact that your book ends in 1997, as does Conservative representation in Westminster, obviously in that Labour landslide at the time. But also, obviously, from Welsh perspective, that's when devolution was won, and it was largely won, some might say, by John Redwood, doing a particularly bad job of being what some people would describe as the Governor General of Wales, as Secretary of State. I think former podcast guest Carwyn Jones, former First Minister, said that they should have put a statue up to John Redwood outside the Senedd for the work that he did persuading Welsh people of the case for devolution. Obviously, largely speaking, the Conservative Party was opposed to devolution, a national devolution to Wales. But I suppose what the question I would ask you is, how much do you think the slender victory for the Yes campaign was due to the Conservative governments of 1979 to 1997? How much was it just the other factors that were taking place in Wales, and notably, I suppose you could also say the shift in the Labour Party that won that.
Yeah, I think all of those things are relevant, and I won't go into all the details. I do think, and I say in the book, that you Wyn Roberts's in government in the 80s and into the 90s paved the way to some extent for devolution to be possible, in that they created the conditions in which it was more palatable. And then, of course, you have certain politicians like John Redwood probably doing things that didn't help the Conservative cause, because of course when it came to the 97 referendum, they were arguing against it, which doesn't necessarily doesn't seem to fit with the argument that I make. So yeah, considering how tight that vote was, I think without those two factors, both the Conservatives making it possible, but also making a bad fist at arguing against it, or being the representatives of the party in Wales in the mid to late 1990s, that probably did enough to swing the results, I would imagine.
Now, I'm leaping ahead now because I know that you have a train to catch.
I've got a little bit more time. I'm more conscious of just not boring your listeners by going on for too long.
Impossible. Have you met our listeners? Our listeners are probably lapping this up. How would you characterise, the period since we've just celebrated 25 years of the establishment of the Parliament here in Wales? How would you characterise the journey that the party has been on since that period, where for not only up to but for a long time after the devolution referendum, the party in Westminster was doing everything it could to try and prevent and oppose devolution?
Characterising the journey will feel familiar to many of your listeners, which is that the role of Nick Bourne over quite a long period of time in Wales to try and both, I don't like this phrase modernise, but going through a modernisation project, and also trying to say, look, this is happening now, we need to work with it as opposed to being against it, and also to say that we need to project a more Welsh friendly image, did change the nature of the party in Wales to some extent. But my argument is that still leaves Tories here between a rock and a hard place, because I don't see really the way in which they can go to be more, I mean, not going to be more popular in the foreseeable future, full stop. But, when circumstances are good for them, when conditions are right for them, on one hand, yes, they could be more kind of pro-Welsh, if you like, more liberal, sort of more soft, small n, nationalistic even perhaps. And that might bring on board some people. But the problem is that, and you see this in the records, this is really there in the archives, that alienates a huge number of its core natural supporters. And the alternative, which is what I think the current leadership has done, and which I don't think is necessarily a terrible strategy, even though a lot of people around here where I live in Pontcanner in Cardiff probably would say, oh, how ghastly. But this idea of being a lot more kind of robust down the line, small c conservative, emphasising the British element of politics or the British element of kind of Welsh political life, is potentially going to bring on board more of the apathetic natural conservatives who just don't really vote in Senedd elections. And it's probably not going to shift the dial again very much, but I always say I'm very glad I don't have to and don't want to advise them on this, because I actually wouldn't know what to say, because I think both strategies have their drawbacks. Because the thing I've always thought, the Nick Bourne approach, which is to essentially look more like the Lib Dems and Plaid Cymru to try and make a coalition palatable. Well, a lot of people out there are just not going to vote Tory anyway, because they're going to vote, in that case, they're going to vote Lib Dem or Plaid Cymru or whatever. So it's tricky. And I think that's why there is a ceiling of Conservative support in Wales that is almost impossible to push through, because people just don't see what the offering really is. And if they are very robust, conservative, right-wing types, they either think the Senedd shouldn't exist, they don't turn out and they don't vote for it, or they maybe in the past have voted for UKIP and may well vote for Reform next time. So it's not an easy position for the party to be in.
Yeah, I think we've seen the party wrestling with different influences over the years, and neither beast nor fowl really, in terms of being able to address some of the questions about how to succeed in Wales, if indeed it is possible for the party to do so. I suppose one of the sort of fundamental tensions that you just alluded to there is the unionism aspect of the party. I mean, we talk about the Conservative Party. I've mentioned before that it's formerly the Conservative and Unionist Party. But for all of the economic policies that the party has adopted over the years, whether it's that kind of vision of the union, both in its membership and in its leadership, that has kind of prevented it from adapting to the era of a multipolar United Kingdom. Do you think that there is a sort of, is there either an opportunity or a problem there for the party that it can't get past? I mean, just on that question of the kind of constitution and reflecting the reality as it is.
Yes, I don't think it poses a particular opportunity. I think it is a problem, and I think it's something that they can't really work through. I do subscribe to this idea that in the past they've been quite good at being unionists in the definition of the term, of articulating that the union is important, but also that the distinct differences between the nations are something to be emphasized and celebrated. But constitutionally, it's all one unit. And I think at its best, it can do that. And I think it's possible that it can do that while still saying, that it doesn't like what it might call the woke agenda, or, all these kind of cultural things that it could potentially still talk about, whilst having that view on unionism, that the two things could technically be brought together. But I just don't think that, because of all the history, it used to be the 1930s depression, now it's kind of still to some extent the deindustrialization of the 1980s, and potentially for some people now it's 14 wasted years and Brexit and all that kind of stuff. With all that baggage, I just don't see how the party really offer something that is palatable to the majority of, or anything close to the majority of voters in Wales.
Now, you've just popped my bubble there. I was literally about to talk about another referendum where actually the people of Wales, I think arguably could be said, backed the Conservative proposition. Now, it wasn't, I don't know, maybe I'm mischaracterising it.
No, I think that's fair.
But Wales voted, albeit narrowly, for that proposition, and for myriad reasons. But in terms of those opportunities for conservatism, particularly in this era where we're seeing what the Americans and certain European leaders are calling national conservatism, that kind of very firm, very strict vision of what a nation is, often militaristic, in America certainly linked to a sort of particular version of Christianity. Would you say that reflects the fact that there is a potential in Wales for a certain vision, a certain type of conservatism, but maybe not the Conservative Party's type of conservatism in Wales? Is that fair?
It's in one of the maybe the penultimate paragraph of my book, and I can't call to mind exactly how I've phrased it, but it is almost exactly like that. Which is, I say that I think there is a Conservative vote out there for the taking, which I think could be, like you say, distinct, robustly Conservative, probably more nationalistic than the Tories are willing to be as the Unionist party. But the Tories can't be that force, I don't think. And the European Union referendum, what I liked so much about that referendum, I didn't like very much about it, but one of the things was the decoupling of party allegiance to one side or the other, and the realization that there are a lot of people out there who normally would vote Labour who then also would vote Leave in the EU referendum. But if those things then mapped onto party political lines, then in the 2019 general election, to put it very bluntly, the Valleys would have done a red wall. Two terms there that we don't particularly like using, but just as shorthand, the Valleys some of the Valley seats might have gone Tory in the way that Bolsover and things in the north of England did, but they didn't, because they are distinctly politically different and they have a different identity and different culture. So again, once you put it back onto the party label, then things sort of, not completely, but they sort of revert to normal, and that is because of the Tory brand, I think.
That's interesting. It's certainly interesting, and I think as we record, we are in the middle of the election period. And there is likely to be a looming battle for the soul of the Conservative Party and the future direction of it starting, I suppose, on the evening of the 4th of July. What do you see as being the kind of leading forces behind that will compete in that era in the Conservative Party, both from a UK and Welsh perspective?
Well, on the UK front, I guess it does depend to some extent which MPs are returned to the House of Commons. And this is going to be very interesting. There's been some good work done on this. The direction I would expect the party to go in, for all sorts of reasons, which would be, I guess, aligned with a sort of reform party style direction, isn't guaranteed, because a lot of the MPs who might drive that or argue for that are going to lose their seats because they hold more marginal constituencies. And what you do see and do find is that the more kind of socially liberal, perhaps more what you might call centrist MPs are more likely to still be there in the next Parliament. I also think, incidentally, that when they do go down to defeat on this manifesto that feels a little bit more right-wing, with things like national service being put forward, the argument will then be, well, look how big our defeat was when we stood on a slightly more right-wing manifesto. That's not conspiracy theory. Maybe I've heard people say that it's almost like they're doing this deliberately to get defeated on some of these issues. So that's in the mix as well. But my general thought is that if you, at the end of the day, the next leader is going to be chosen by the grassroots, and the Tory party members are, I think, quite keen. They chose Liz Truss at the end of the day. Come on, they're probably keen for someone who emphasises less of a nanny state, kind of lower taxes, tougher on immigration and things like that. So I would say we shouldn't be surprised if we do see a Suella Braverman-ification of the Conservative Party, and certainly one that feels more populist, if you like, in the next couple of years. I would expect that to be the case.
And what of Wales? In Wales at the moment, famously, the Conservative Party has 3 leaders. It has the Secretary of State, it has the chair of the party in Wales, and it has the leader of the Welsh Conservative group in the Senedd. Do you see any either structural or personality change, or platform change in any of those roles, because it is one of those it is a particularly weird hydra, to have different leadership looking different ways and with different perspectives. And all the while, the only, as Andrew R.T. Davis has said on a number of occasions, the only Conservative leader with a direct mandate from the people of Wales is the leader of the Senedd group.
Mm.
Do you see that the party, changing either structurally or temperamentally in Wales?
It'll be interesting, won't it, if we do have, say, a Suella Braverman-led Conservative Party, but that may well not happen, but someone a bit like that. And then in the foreseeable future, the leadership in the Senedd changes and maybe the baton passes to, let's just say, for example, the two Sams, Sam Kurtz, Sam Rowlands, people who would feel and look very different to the Westminster leadership in this scenario that I'm painting. And might that be the situation where you have a much more distinct Senedd group that feels perhaps more moderate? I don't know, but perhaps just softly spoken, I guess, is one of the things I'm trying to say, and less populist than the Westminster government, and almost maybe tries to put some distance between the two of them. I have no skin in the game here. I know Samuel Kurtz a little bit and Sam Rowlands a little bit, and I think they are bright enough and could very well lead the group. But if they did, it would not be along those more populist lines. So we may well see one of the greater divergences between the two groups. Because if you think about, David Cameron and Nick Bourne sat quite nicely together. Boris Johnson and Andrew R.T. Davis, can't remember where the overlap was between them, but there certainly was, and they kind of sat together relatively coherently in terms of politics and presentation. But it could well be very different in the future, and that would be, all these kind of things for people like us, they're interesting, aren't they? Because they are good talking points.
Absolutely. So, final question, Sam, and I appreciate you've given us a bit more time. And this is a question I know you fielded from everyone, is when is the book about the Conservatives in Wales from 1997 to 2024 going to come out?
Or 2030, whatever it'll be by the time I get round to writing it. I think we do need to leave a big chunk of time before someone writes the next book, whether it's me or not. I don't know. Maybe I will. But the truth is, life is different at the moment. I work I teach history at UCL, but I teach it on a kind of an interdisciplinary education studies program. So I don't do as much of this political stuff anymore. So I suspect that by the time I get around to it, it could be a retirement project. But I wouldn't hold anyone back from, do you know what I'd actually love? I really would love someone else to write it using my book as kind of a reference point, and then to see what they do with the next part, as in part two, using what I've said and either building on it or disagreeing with it. That would be fun.
Excellent call to action there. I love it. So I've said it a number of times, but I can't say it enough. Thank you to Sam for your time today. And for the book, which is phenomenal. And I think, in it really, there was a vacuum crying out for this book to be written, and we're incredibly lucky that not only has it been written, but it's been written so well. Thank you. We'll make sure a link to buy it is in the show notes. If anyone would like to follow you on social media, I believe you're still you're one of the holdouts on what used to be Twitter, Sam.
I do virtually no social media. I really would recommend people not doing it. It's life is so much nicer when you don't do it. But yes, I am on whatever Twitter's called now, and I tweet a little bit about my work and mainly about the runs that I do on the weekend.
And you are at Sam Blaxland, is that?
Oh yes, at Sam Blaxland, just my name. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you again, and thank you not only for that, but also tolerating my horribly croaky voice today. We very much hope that we'll have you on the pod at some point again in the future, Sam. And I wish
I'd love to come back.
All the best for your trip to Australia and for avoiding the UK general election results night as best you can.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.